and welcome to Man's Model Moments. In my last Teamy video I looked at more naval subjects, and I mentioned then that I was going to be doing an unboxing and build review of the new Revell Type 9 submarine in 1/144 scale when it crossed my desk. Well, they arrived this past week, so here it is. The box front has some very nice artwork and Revell's distinctive branding, whereas the reverse shows some pictures of a completed model with multilingual descriptions. That's all great, but what's not so great is the end opening box, something I spoke about in my Repairing Revell video that got a lot of agreement about this from all of you. Please change these, Revell. So, sliding everything out of this, we have several bagged frames including the main hull pieces, as well as all of the paperwork, which we'll have a look at first. You get 3 bags of plastic, and we'll also look at these in more detail shortly. The instructions are in Revell's standard 2020s format of semi-glossy full-colour A4 booklet, and they look great. The cover features a nice colour photo of the completed model under its recognisable branding. The first 2 pages cover all the pictorial tips and tricks, along with icons, each having those 21 different language explanations. We then finish these icons and show the 9 colours used over an entire 2 pages, and I can't help but wonder how much these rather wasteful last 3 pages of full colour printing add to the cost, compared to that saved on the end opening box. Anyway, we then move to a useful layout of all the frames and parts for reference, showing the small number of parts that are not for use in the kit. There looks like there is some differential colouring here, though in reality there isn't. It's just Revell have printed all the decking lines on the parts here, making these look darker. The first sheet of actual instructions has us drill a whole bunch of holes in the kit before we begin. The rest of the instructions are standard and clear, with the last step being the simple rigging of the model. We then have the 2 schemes provided, both for U-190. The first of these is under the Kriegsmarine service during World War II. With the second scheme being under Royal Canadian Navy service from May 1945 onwards. This is exactly the same as Revell's larger 172nd rendition of this subject, and I'll come back to that later. The decal sheet is pretty small, with most of these markings actually being for the supplied display stand. The most interesting markings are the flags, with both being very nicely rendered, though the Kriegsmarine flag is missing its swastika of course. We start off with the 2 large hull halves and front deck. The latter has lovely recessed detail, but bizarrely the hull is covered in huge raised panel lines that look like something from the 1960s. Now these U-boats did have welded seams, but here's a side-by-side of an actual 9C and the Revell kit, and you can see how heavy these are. Compare those welds to the detail on the anchor, and it's not like Revell couldn't have made these more subtle, and they visually look very clunky. If you scrape all of these off with a knife, you'll probably be left with about the right level of seam, but out of the box these do look off, even for a 1/72nd scale kit, so for 1/144 scale they are huge. Okay, let's move on to the first bag of frames, which has the conning tower pieces, which feature quite nicely recessed detail, though the railings for these are again thick even for 1/72nd scale. Overall, the parts do seem nicely cast in decent plastic, without obvious flash. Once again, the railings are quite thick, but this does at least make them robust. The final bag of plastic gives us the main deck platform, which has nice detail, both raised and recessed, all the way across it. We also have a funny little frame with just the rear deck piece on, and then the frame for the stand, which was warped on my example as you can see here. The other frame seems okay, but the proof is in the pudding, so let's put it together. Now, as I mentioned before, we start by drilling lots of holes, and these are basically all of those labelled with a number 2 inside, which points to other potential release versions of this kit. That's great, because U-190 was, as we'll see, slightly atypical for its type, narrowing the building options for those of us that like to go a little off-piste. That slightly atypical part of U-190 starts with it being fitted with snorkel gear, which is what this insert in the hull is for. It fits in very snugly with no problem. The main hull has 3 of these strengthening bulkheads, which are helpfully labelled with their direction, and they fit perfectly. This is really good, both practical and useful to the modeller. So far, so good. Next up we have the front torpedo launchers, with this little internal insert which allows you to pose the doors open or closed, which is nice. These pieces don't go together so snugly, having a little bit of wobble to their fit, and also some visible ejector pin marks that are quite difficult to clean up should you wish to. The fit into the hull is also a bit nebulous, with the raised internal positioning lines actually being shallower than the external weld seams. Still, with a bit of care and jostling you can get it into position. Then we come to join the main hull halves together. Those internal bulkheads are great here because they align everything really well and they fit perfectly. That's good because the alignment pins and slight warpage of the hull at the ends of the boat don't help you out. I'd recommend doing as I did here and glue the centre section between the 2 central bulkheads first and then work on the fore and aft. If you have suitable clamps handy, then you're probably going to need them to get the edges and ends of the front and rear to join together. Fortunately, those bulkheads come to the rescue and allow you to do this without one part of the hull pushing another out of alignment. I used tape to pull my halves in where needed, but that wasn't quite enough for a really good gap-free bond, so I did need a smidge of filling at the fore later on. Whilst that dries, you can put together the supplied stand, which was that frame I mentioned before that was visibly warped. That does translate through to the long stand pieces, which I don't think are designed very well to prevent this, and I spent some time trying to straighten them out. It's very simple and it goes together easily, but it does feel flimsy when it's built as well. Here you can see it's a very snug fit to the sub. I didn't glue mine on, but you can see it flexes and it's just balancing the sub. The boat adds strength to the stand, not vice versa. The hydrodynamic prop covers are next, each being a simple 2-piece assembly. That when built goes onto the hull seamlessly. Next is the boat's group listening device, which is a 3-part assembly which seems unnecessarily complex, perhaps because Revell have depicted this with protruding pimples, which aren't anything like accurate as the actual ones were flush to the hull. Still, the actual fitment to the hull is very good. Putting the prop shafts in is a simple matter too, as they have long parts that slide through this guide piece, and then it's just a matter of getting them into those hydrodynamic assemblies that we placed earlier on. Everything can then be secured with extra thin. The props themselves go on without any problem. As do the hydroplanes, securing these into holes and the prop shaft guide. This fiddly little support piece goes on next, and then the support piece for the rudders attaches to this and the hull. With that on, it's a simple matter to put the rudders into the holes in the hull and this support and make sure everything is aligned properly. Now to the deck, and the rear hull piece goes into place very nicely. As does the front deck, though my lack of clamping the hull resulted in a slight gap at the fore, but that was my own fault. Before the main deck goes in, you need to attach the schnorkel. This just press fits into the hull insert, allowing you to pose it later if you wish. That does mean you have to do a bit of wiggling to get the main central deck into position over the aligning part of the schnorkel, but once it's in position, everything falls into place as it should and just needs securing with cement. I did find I needed a bit of tape to help in the centre, the furthest distance from the bulkheads, and just at the front where the top deck pinches in, but otherwise this was a very good fit. At this point I decided I was going to close the torpedo tube doors, so put them in the shut position here. You can see I've also not added the front hydroplanes here, as I waited until much later in the build so I didn't accidentally knock these off. We then go to some of the smallest and most fiddly parts in the kit, with the assembly of the flat guns. First up are the twin 20mm guns, which are actually the easiest of these assemblies, not providing any real issues aside from that of their small size. One thing you do need to be aware of though is the little stabilising tripod, which is optional to put on here, because alternatively it goes on the deck later on, but this is easily missed amongst all the paint options at this step, as it simply directs you to step 46 much later on in the booklet. I think that this could have been made clearer. The fiddliest assembly by some long way, however, is also another slightly unusual one, and that is the Zwilling 37mm flak. Most Type 9s only had a single gun. The way Revell have done this has you glue each gun to one side of the mounting, then bring the halves of the mounting together, which didn't seem to work well on mine at all, not helped by the fact that one of my posts was bent on the sprue. Onto this assembly then goes the armoured shield mount across the top. Then we have the mounting for one of the axis control wheels. And then the tiny control wheel itself. You then have two more control wheel mounts, each with two control wheels, which will drive many to distraction trying to put them on, I'm sure. You then need to mount these on the shield, which again is not as easy as it seems. These two completed assemblies can then be brought together, which again is not as simple as it should be. This clip is at 6 times speed and isn't all the futzing about that I did to get this looking right. Aftermarket replacements for these may be the way to go. Now I just want to take a moment to thank all of you who have supported me directly through YouTube memberships and Patreon. This really does keep the channel going, and without you it would be very difficult for me to be able to continue doing this. Now if you're only just seeing your name on here for the first time, it's because I update this monthly, and if I've prepared some videos ahead of time, then there may still have the old list on, even if the list has been updated since then. Don't worry though, your name will get on the list and will continue to appear throughout your support. If you are considering supporting me, YouTube channel membership is by far the easiest way to do this, since Patreon is becoming a more challenging platform to engage with. Whichever you choose, however, I absolutely appreciate your contributions, and don't forget to come and check out the private members Discord, which you get access to at any level. As a relief from this, we go on to the conning tower. You actually spend a fair bit of time with this assembly, probably the majority of the time in the kit actually, but that's okay as it's a rewarding set of steps. First, the top deck goes into a recessed groove, providing a positive fit for both halves. The Wintergarten deck goes on next. Followed by the two-piece widened rear deck for the two Zwilling flak installations. There are then various installations that go on inside the upper conning tower, all of which fit perfectly. We can then cap off the front of the tower, add the hydrodynamic shield, and now it's time for some more fiddly pieces. The most problematic of them being the speaking tube and hatch, but I didn't have to resort to tweezers, so they're not really too bad. Next to go on are what I think are baffled hatches, but let me know if you know any better. None of these is difficult, and they all have positive positioning lugs on the deck. More fiddly bits now with ladders and tubes on both sides. The ladders are very much representative rather than accurate, so I expect photo etch will replace them on many people's models. The two-piece snorkel mount can then be put together and installed on the tower. Followed by the feed tube to the engines. Again, as this is mounted through the holes we drilled earlier, then I'd like to think we get a non-snorkel version of the 9 in future. The horseshoe-shaped life preserver can then be put into its position on the side of the hull too, as well as the side piece that goes ahead of it, which I neglected to film, but it's completely straightforward. I'm not sure what this tube is, but it actually proved much more of a pain than it really had any right to be, but it eventually succumbed to extra thin under pressure. Next are all the railings for the conning tower. As I mentioned earlier, these are very much out of scale, being equivalent to 20cm or larger pipes on the real thing, but they do benefit from strength because of that. You could always use these as a template to make your own, or get aftermarket replacements. I actually don't mind them too much for a casual build, as they're robust enough for a younger or more inexperienced modeler to tackle, and they give the right kind of impression, and they go on well. That is, for the most part. The two exceptions are this cross brace, which doesn't have any really good locating positions, and it's tricky to get to sit correctly. And the other being the lower rear rail, which looks easy but is a bit of a pig to get to play nicely. The periscope assembly is built so you can raise or lower the periscopes, which is a bit toy-like and adds to the complexity of a build that I'm not sure many kids are going to make, but never mind. Now back to those hydroplanes I left off earlier, and these attach very positively into these holes and the recessed positioning grooves on the hull. I also popped the anchor in place, and then the time had come to add the conning tower to the hull, and whilst you might think all those railings would present a problem, this is actually a completely painless step with everything fitting wonderfully well. We then have some final pieces to go in the conning tower. And I initially thought that this was some sort of signal lamp array, but it's actually a radar antenna and very chunky for what it's supposed to be. The periscope assembly can then be fitted into the conning tower, and if I were making this again, I'd probably leave off all the railings and fiddly bits until after doing this, as it would be easier on all counts. Finishing up, we have these 4 pieces to go on at the front, with just measurements on the instructions to guide us. Then there is what I think is the forward mooring post, then the same on the aft, followed by the 2 rear jumping wire mounts. The last thing to add are what I think are the diesel engine exhaust outlets, though looking at historical photos I think the instructions tell you to put these on backwards. With those done, however, let's look at the finished boat. Well, this is an interesting kit, being essentially a 1/144 scale version of the 1/72 scale kit of exactly the same subject. It's a bit of a mixed bag, and I'm not sure of the exact section of the market that Revell are aiming for with it. On the one hand, there are some really clunky details, the frankly ridiculous external raised detail being the most obvious, but the oversized railings, inaccurate GHG, and super chunky radar being other examples. These are going to put off naval modelers wanting a decent submodel that doesn't take up too much room. On the other hand, there are some very fiddly assemblies, the AA guns especially, that make it difficult to see this in the hands of anything but at least a somewhat experienced modeler. In addition, U-190 was a bit of an oddball for a Type 9C U-boat, with its rather rare Zwilling 37mm flat gun and schnorkel gear. That means even if you wanted to make it as a schnorkel-fitted Mark 9, you'd need to address the AA gun at a minimum. Having said that, Revell released their 1/72 scale kit as U-190, U-505, U-67 and U-154, all of which vary in their configuration, so let's hope we see those versions in this scale too. I say that because, even with its shortcomings, this was still a really enjoyable build, and something different for me. One 144 scale is a bit on the small side for creating really realistic models from my point of view, without everything becoming really fragile. As such, I don't mind the chunkiness of some of the details. If they did really bother me, then I can build it again and replace them. That latter point brings me nicely to price point. This kit is $23.99 RRP, and you can find it cheaper at a few online retailers too. With the finished model being a shade over half a metre long, that makes it pretty good value, I think. Especially when you remember that a Revell 1/72nd scale tank that is about 1/5 of the size is pushing £20, or an Airfix 1/72nd scale Harrier is actually more expensive. A 1/700th scale battleship is pushing £40, despite being considerably smaller too. So for those just wanting something a bit different, even as a Mojo build, this is a pretty good buy. Even for those who want a super accurate kit, just over £20 for a really solid base kit is pretty good too, and it's a reasonable price if you want to challenge yourself to improve a kit without having to do a lot of plastic hacking. In fact, I'm quite tempted to do exactly that and see just how good this model could be. Maybe in the future when Revell release an earlier, more standard Mark 9 with a deck gun perhaps. That's all for this instalment of Man's Model Moments. If you enjoyed the video, please click the like button, subscribe to the channel for more like it, and share this video with others you think would also enjoy it. You can also follow me on Instagram, Twitter and Facebook, and if you're feeling generous then I also have a Patreon, which is absolutely the best way of helping me to grow the channel and produce more content like this. With that, I hope you have plenty of modelling moments of your own, and I look forward to welcoming you on the next video.